Paup. I'm a clinical psychology graduate student from Washington State University, and today I'll be presenting a longitudinal investigation of the relational self-schema measure. All right. So to start off, what is the relational self-schema measure, or also known as the RSSM? So the RSSM was developed as a modern theory-driven self-schema measure in order to essentially assess individuals' self-schemata. It ideally evaluates chronically accessible relational self-schemata, so how people think about themselves in relational roles or relationships. And we specifically are targeting the relationships that are most accessible, so the ones that are coming to mind more frequently. And we do this through evaluating people's psychological need satisfactions and their need frustrations within, in this case, interpersonal relationships that are most chronically accessible. So as to why we're doing this, essentially there's a strong field of literature that suggests that beliefs about the self really influence the way that people interact with the world, and that also interacts with the way that people can develop things like psychopathology. So it's an area that we're very interested in. And while there are currently measures of self-schemata, they don't tend to be relational. They tend to be singular. So like the dysfunctional attitude scale, the Young Schema questionnaire, you might be familiar with these. They tend to think about just how someone thinks about themselves in perspective of the world in general, whereas modern conceptualizations of self-schemata is that the self-schemata are multiple, so we have many different ones, not just a single one. They're relational, they involve roles, and they're flexible. They change and become active or deactive over time. So the purpose of the present study is relatively straightforward. As this new measure, the RSSM is an emerging measure, we wanted to evaluate some of the psychometric properties like the test-retest reliability. And one of the ways that this was accomplished was through doing this study in a longitudinal style. So it was conducted across 2 distinct time points. Additionally, I was very interested in determining some of the ecological validity factors of the RSSM. So can it predict psychological outcomes, which we could also do in that longitudinal design. So do reported need satisfactions and need frustrations in the relational schemata, do they predict changes in psychological outcomes across the time points, so time 1 versus time 2? And we hypothesized that increased need frustration in the relational self-schemata would be associated with outcome measures of increased negative psychological outcomes, and similarly, increased need satisfactions in the relational self-schemata would be associated with increased positive psychological outcomes. So to give you a little bit of background on the present study. So for our participants, they were all Washington State University undergraduate students. At time 1, we had 134 participants and a fairly large attrition. At time 2, we had 78 participants. Longitudinal studies can be a little challenged in that way. There were an average of 8 weeks between responses as we were working within a kind of a semester time frame. People responded at the beginning of the semester and they responded at the end of the semester. And just to give you an idea of the demographics that were involved in the study, approximately 90% of female participants, 80% of them were between the ages of 18 to 19, and 60% of them were white or Caucasian. So the measures that were implemented, and these were implemented at both time points, the relational self-schema measure was implemented, as well as the ADDIE-27, evaluating some anxiety, distress, and depression symptomologies, the RIF scales of psychological well-being, which tap into things like autonomy, sense of self, environmental mastery, an objective measure of stress, so just things that happened to the participants, and a subjective measure of stress, so their perceptions of how stressful their environment is. And again, administered at both time points. So to give you an idea of what happened, I'll start with the good news. So the RSSM test-retest reliability, as you can see here in this bivariate correlation chart right down the center here, the time 1 and time 2 subscales of the RSSM were relatively highly correlated. There were significant positive correlations between what we expected there to be. So that was good in terms of the test-retest reliability. It lined up how we expected. They weren't perfect, of course, but we also weren't expecting that, as the study did require there to be some change across time points in order for that second hypothesis to be viable. However, speaking of that second hypothesis, the ability of the RSSM scales to predict psychological outcomes, while the need satisfaction scales were correlated positively with the positive outcomes and need frustration scales were correlated positively with the negative psychological outcomes, unfortunately, using a more stringent analysis of a hierarchical regression, where we actually controlled for the initial psychological outcome states, we found very, very few significant relationships. So that more stringent psychological test didn't find as much. So psychometric implications of this. There was good test-retest reliability. We did allow people to freely select their relational targets. So they talked about their need satisfactions and need frustrations across targets of their choice. So there's some inherent kind of variability, which means that it was even more difficult to just demonstrate test-retest reliability, but we did. There was also strong evidence for convergent and discriminant validity. So the correlations were as anticipated. Things that we expected to positively correlate did. The things we expected to negatively correlate did very significantly and pretty much at the strengths we expected. But when it comes to implications for the actual ability to predict those psychological outcomes, generally poor or insignificant findings. However, there was some fledgling evidence for predictive validity. So autonomy frustration at time 1 was associated with distress and depressed thoughts at time 2, controlling for distress and depressed thoughts at time 1. Initial relatedness satisfaction was associated with increased positive interactions at time 2, again, controlling for that at time 1. And initial competence autonomy satisfaction or control was associated with increased personal agency independence at time 2, controlling for that at time 1. So some findings to investigate. My last little bit here, the limitations of future directions. There was significant drop off between the time points. It affected power in a pretty big way, made it kind of hard to find things. Almost all analyses were in the predicted directions. Many failed to meet significance. So that's something to address in future studies, that methodological concern. Also, a longer longitudinal period could be used to evaluate that long-term stability that we would expect to find in the measure. But of course, we were kind of stuck within that semester time frame. So that was a little bit difficult for this study. We also found anchor effects on some of the RSSM subscales where people were saying they were actually pretty satisfied with their relationships and there wasn't many frustrations. So it suggests that this might be more useful in a clinical population where there's more variability, where people are less satisfied and they're finding more frustrations in their relational schemata. And then lastly, while there was good initial psychometric support for the RSSM, which is exciting, there is further investigation that addresses some of these methodological flaws that needs to be required to demonstrate that ecological validity that we kind of failed to find in this study. All right, thank you. Any questions?
Okay, remember everyone can type in messages into the chat for questions, but yeah, I would be interested to see what this study would look like, maybe in variable different populations, especially during the pandemic and how people feel in results to all things 2020, I guess.
I definitely agree. It's really interesting. We happened to finish this like right before the pandemic happened, and afterwards it's like, wow, this probably would have been completely different.